The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender as the war between Israel and Iran enters its sixth day, marking a dangerous new phase in the conflict. Now, Trump also revealed plans to send representatives to either Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff or Vice President J.D. Vance for talks with Iranian officials, signaling a possible diplomatic overture even as tensions escalate. Meanwhile, Iran is grappling with unprecedented internal security breaches and a sharp decline in its regional influence, raising urgent questions about where this conflict is heading and how far it could go. And to help unpack the latest developments in the Israel-Iran conflict, joining us today is Dr. Leon Goldsmith, who's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Otago. Hi, Dr. Goldsmith. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right, Doctor, Israel and Iran are continuing to trade blows as a sixth day of fighting beckons. Now, explosions have been reported in both Tehran and Isfahan, and Israel striking deep within Iranian territory. What's happening on the ground so far?
Well, I mean, this is becoming a major turning point in the Middle East balance of power. I think it's probably the most serious conflict we've seen since almost the Gulf Wars or the Iran-Iraq War. So I think that whatever happens, the Middle East is never going to be the same. But of course, on the ground, what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of damage, like your introduction said, to Iran's regime, to its economy, to its military capacity, to its leadership. So, of course, there's also been some damage done to Israeli infrastructure and civilians at a much lesser extent, given the Iranians don't seem, due to the losses that they're taking at home, to be able to launch their full sort of arsenal of missiles, etc., back at Israel. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. It's happening very quickly, and it's sort of something we have to watch very closely and keep trying to understand.
Right. Well, how would you gauge the scale and intent of Israel's military strategy at this point? Are they aiming for a knockout blow?
I think it's increasingly becoming looking like that, yes. I mean, what Donald Trump is saying from an American perspective is quite different from what the Israeli leadership, including the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister, are saying in terms of what they think is going to happen. So the Israelis are saying that they're going to disable fully the nuclear capacity. The Americans are saying that they're looking for a comprehensive surrender followed by a deal. But some of the language used by the Israelis also suggests that they think or hope that one of the indirect consequences of this will be a sort of like a crumbling or a collapse of the Islamic Republic itself. I think that's not necessarily off the table. It sounds dramatic, but I think it could possibly happen. And we saw how quickly what we thought was a rehabilitated and strong Assad regime, how quickly that fell in Syria as well. So anything is possible at this stage.
At this point, though, Doctor, how far are both sides willing to go?
Well, of course. I mean, it really depends for the Israelis on how much they can depend on American support and also what happens in terms of Arab states' willingness to be able to sort of sit idly by. Of course, a lot of the Arab states have surreptitiously supported Israel in different ways in terms of previous attacks against Israel. So they'll be gauging the extent of support that they have, of success that they have, domestic opinion in terms of how much the Israeli public can tolerate in terms of damage at home. But with all those things, I think that Israel is prepared to go a long way in this war. They seem to be, they've been planning for this for decades. This is, to them, a pivotal moment in their Israeli history, but it's also a very dangerous moment for the whole Middle East.
I mean, there has been a lot of anxiety surrounding reports that Israeli strikes have damaged Iran's Natanz enrichment site. What does this mean for Iran's nuclear timeline then? Could it push them to accelerate development more aggressively?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, they really are backs against the wall. I think they were prepared to go quite slowly and gradually while they had, like, especially under the Obama, the nuclear deal from 2015, to gradually move towards that capacity. But now that they are basically fully exposed and vulnerable, they will try to achieve that by any means possible, and whether or not the Israelis will allow that to happen and whether they have the intelligence to be able to block that at any level. This is a big country. The Iranians have also been planning and working towards their strategic objectives for a long, long time. So if they can, I think they will try to achieve at least one or two nuclear weapons, which is only going to increase the intensity of the Israelis' objective, which is to wipe out that potential completely. So there's a real intensity of the cycle of conflict here, which we haven't seen previously, which is very dangerous indeed.
I mean, Israel is believed to have nuclear weapons, though it's never confirmed. How true is this? And with both sides escalating, how real is the threat of a nuclear misstep here, Doctor?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Israelis have had a nuclear weapon capacity since the 1960s, even though, as you say, they don't confirm nor deny that. I don't think Israel will feel there's any need for them to use a nuclear device unless they feel completely that they're sort of like an existential situation. And the fact that Iran currently doesn't have any nuclear weapon means that that's the whole point of the exercise, is to prevent them from having to use anything like that. Interesting comments from one of the Iranian politicians recently saying that Pakistan would somehow provide that nuclear deterrence on their behalf if Israel were to go, whether Pakistan has not confirmed or that they would do that though.
I mean, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has maintained that preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon is the main goal of Israel's military offensive. But Israeli defense forces have also carried out strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure and military sites, which is, raising questions about Netanyahu's real endgame. So, Doctor, what does Israel really want in Iran? Is regime change in Iran a realistic goal for Israel?
So, of course, they've struck gas facilities that the Iranians share with Qatar and South Pars. They've also struck the national television broadcast in Tehran, which doesn't seem to relate to the nuclear objective either. It's related to trying to cripple the communications of the state, which is more along the lines of trying to collapse a regime and bring about regime change. I think that the Israelis also see this, like the collapse of the Islamic Republic, as a form of preventing the nuclear risk that they perceive, because, as we know, unless the Americans can be encouraged to actually participate as well, it's not really clear that the Israelis have the total capacity, the B-2 bombers and the bunker buster bombs that could actually fully take out, especially Fordow, the main nuclear facility. So without being able to actually fully take out those assets, without American support, the only way that they could prevent a nuclear risk is to actually collapse the whole regime. And of course, they would, they have some delusion that the restoration of the Pahlavi monarchy and a friendly Iranian post-revolution or post-collapse state might emerge. I'm sure these thoughts have entered the Israeli mind, but they do remember fondly the days when Iran was a close ally rather than a formidable foe.
Well, Iran's regional influence appears to be weakening as well here. I mean, several senior military commanders close to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, have been killed in Israeli strikes. So, Dr. Goldsmith, how significant are these losses of key figures to Iran's strategic coordination?
Well, there's the intellectual capacity of the decision making and the experience of all of those inner core members is going to have a massive, impact on their ability to be able to coordinate a response. There's also the fact that the cyber attacks, there's still the lasting legacy of, remember the walkie-talkie attacks with Hezbollah and Lebanon. So they're very reluctant in terms of the usage of their communications technology and all of these things. And you mentioned about the influence of Iran at the regional level. I think it's almost completely gone. I mean, if they cannot control and their own airspace that we can't really talk about an Iranian regional influence at this point until they can somehow, get the Israelis to back off. So it's that's what I mean about the whole regional balance of power is shifting.
Right. Well, speaking of which, then, with key advisors reportedly eliminated, how secure is Supreme Leader's position and grip on power? Will he be challenged internally?
Yeah, well, this is another very important point. So, of course, the Supreme Leader is, I think, 86 or 87 years old now, and has had health problems, unsurprisingly. So there will be very serious concern about who's going to take Iran forward at this, or this regime forward at this time. So, of course, it may be that some of the reformists element, which, there have been reformist elements, but they've always been heavily suppressed by the hardliners who have got the actual power, and the assembly of experts and so forth. They might actually make a move to say, well, we actually want to invert the power structure in Iran and topple the main structure of power. There's also the possibility that these protests that we saw in 2022 could erupt again. But I don't see that happening until Israel basically backs off. I don't think any kind of revolution that has come on the back of Israeli military power has ever been successful. We saw this in Lebanon in the 80s with the Christians who tried to rely on Israeli support. But what I think may happen, because of the paranoia about infiltration and spies and people who are working on behalf of Mossad and the Israelis, a kind of a Stalin-esque purge of the regime elite, which will also mean that the regime will sort of devour itself from within, if you know what I mean, because there's total paranoia about who's the traitor and who can we trust, and in those kind of conditions, a regime can unravel very quickly, which is what we also saw in Syria in December last year.
All right. Well, let's also talk about the stance of U.S. here. I mean, U.S. President Donald Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender while simultaneously hinting at diplomacy. How should we interpret this dual messaging? Are they realistic?
I think it's really hard to interpret and predict the U.S. behavior at this point. It must be very hard. I wouldn't want to be a U.S. general trying to maneuver their military assets around because of the erratic nature of the Trump administration right now. I believe that since Donald Trump was in the Middle East in May, and I was there around the same time on my last trip, that he consulted with the Gulf monarchies, who I think he actually trusts more than Netanyahu. I firmly believe that he trusts Saudis and the Emiratis more than he trusts Netanyahu at this point. And I believe that they consulted with him and persuaded him to try to use the weakness of the Iranian regime to put in place a new nuclear deal and leverage that to a much more favorable one than we saw previously in 2015. And I think Trump saw the benefit of that, and he might be able to get some advantage out of that. But of course, the Israelis did not like that idea at all. So that probably explains the timing of why they struck when they did, as the talks were due to recommence in Muscat on Sunday. So what's happened is, because of the speed of events, Trump, with his personality, doesn't want to be seen to be looking like an idiot, whereby the Israelis have basically gone behind his back. And I think he's just flipped his narrative immediately to try and claim that he's the tough guy and he's the one calling for unconditional surrender and putting this pressure on the Iranians. So these are just crazy, unprecedented times in terms of major global powers and the way that they're behaving.
Definitely. Well, I mean, Trump also shared that he is planning to send either envoys Steve Witkoff or Vice President J.D. Vance to meet Iranian officials, and is planning to deploy more aircrafts in the region. How might talks with high-level representatives and Iranian officials go at this stage?
Well, the Iranians have said that they're not prepared to negotiate until Israel calls off its attack. But of course, behind closed doors, they'll be trying to make some pleas for a US intervention and for them to work with maybe the other Arab Gulf states especially to pressure the Israelis to back off, have a ceasefire, and then go into negotiations. So the Iranians will see this as their kind of lifeline. They will be trying to... They've got very experienced negotiators. they feel as if they could probably try to influence the Americans towards pressuring the Israelis. But at the same time, the Witkoff and J.D. Vance, etc., are almost as unpredictable as Donald Trump himself. Like, they're not really experienced diplomats, and it's really hard to predict how that will go.
Okay. Well, circling back here, Iran is also suffering their most dangerous security breach since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. There are reports of an Israeli cyber attack and bans of mobile usage among officials, as you've mentioned earlier in our conversation, Dr. Goldsmith. But what do you think these internal disruptions reveal about Iran's vulnerability right now? And do you think this instability will make Iran more cautious?
As I said before, yes, I think that, well, I mean, what I would say about Iran is that they've built the entire legitimacy of the regime ever since 1979 on being anti-Israel and talking about the destruction of the Zionist entity, and this is a major part of their domestic and regional legitimacy and the narrative of revolution and resistance. And even as the Israelis showed last year in 2024 that they could take out anyone, Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran or Nasrallah in Beirut or whatever, they continued to use that language and narrative, because basically they've got two choices. Either they continue the same narrative of resistance against Israel, or they basically admit that their whole legitimacy that they've rested their regime on, the Islamic Republic on, for the last 45 years is hollow and completely void, and then there's no point for the regime, and at that point it collapses. This is kind of like what we call in political science sort of ontological security. So whether or not they can change their language and become more conciliatory, if that's what I think you mean, and look to compromise with the Israelis and say, look, we are not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. We didn't really mean that we want the destruction of Israel. I don't know. I don't know if they can do that. I don't know if they're capable of changing this regime. But they certainly, if they don't, it may be the end. But of course, on the other side of that, they do have a lot of sympathy. I don't know about in Singapore, but my colleagues here in New Zealand, they're all mostly cheering for Iran. The hatred for Israel is very, very real. And that, as I saw in the Middle East on my last trip, the visceral hatred for Israel is ramping up to new heights never seen before. So the more that Israel wins, the more it loses. So therefore, maybe the Iranians will be clinging on to that. Hard power-wise, they're losing, but perhaps in terms of regional soft power, they can still find something.
Right. Well, looking at the situation right now, before we let you go here, Dr. Goldsmith, do you see this war escalating even further, or do you think there's still space for de-escalation?
Well, you always hope. So the IDF has said today they think that they can wrap things up within a week. What they mean by that, I'm not entirely sure, in terms of the original objective, which was to destroy the Iranian nuclear capacity. They haven't done that. I mean, Fordow is still there, unless they've got some sabotage team that can go in and destroy it on the ground. So I don't know. I mean, I hope that it's over within the next week or so, but it's so hard. I'm not really prepared to predict. It's really hard to say.
Nevertheless, some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldsmith, for joining me today.
You're most welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was Dr. Leon Goldsmith, who's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Otago. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.